Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya, and welcome to another episode of TFiR. Let's talk. Today we have with us Jason Harmon, CTO of Stoplight. Jason, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Swapnil. I appreciate it.
Yeah, since this is the first time you and I are talking, I would love to know a bit more about the company itself. Tell us a bit about Stoplight.
Sure. Stoplight is we're a collaborative API design platform. What that means in practice is typically companies that have either committed to some sort of digital or platform transformation, or in perhaps smaller companies where they're really just committing to sort of an API strategy that they need sort of the platform to do design their platform. And obviously APIs are the sort of core ingredient of building platforms. So we help companies, design great APIs.
It will not be wrong to say that we kind of live in an API-driven world, whether we're talking about cloud-native services, you're running a big service, or even if you look at Tesla cars. So can you also talk about the role of APIs in today's modern world? If you remember, decades ago, we used to say, hey, every company has to be a software company, that every sub-company has to be a cloud strategy. Now, API-driven world. So talk about what role APIs are playing, what is the importance, and why companies should kind of, embrace this new word.
Yeah, it's like the old adage that software is eating the world, right? And I think now we see it's like APIs are eating software. At Stoplight, our top customers, they sell beer and electrical parts, right? Like it's not software tech companies anymore, because if you're running a modern business, you're running software. And if you're running a modern platform, you're building it with APIs. I think especially with the prevalence of mobile apps, and certainly the proliferation of that sort of thing, more digital experiences in a lot of companies, APIs power all those things. Not to mention the customer expectations that, I want the push button integration. I don't want to have to involve developers. I want to be able to just turn on the integration with whatever other platforms make sense in my workflow. That's all powered by APIs too. So it really is everywhere. And, for myself, spent the last 10, 15 years working on this subject. And it's pretty wild to see the world that we told everyone it would be has become, and now it's just everywhere.
Right. And there are two things that are happening. Number one is that there are big companies which are tech companies because the market is, the technologies, if you look at just cloud native space, so many technologies are coming at such a fast pace that it's hard to keep up, even for me, to keep up with what's happening in the market. Forget about getting folks who are skilled in those technologies that can run your workloads in production. Second thing, what is happening is that there are smaller companies, as you said, every company has to be on this. They cannot afford to move that fast, to hire all the developers. Sometimes it's like the CEO itself is also, the owner, the manager, everything, smaller companies. How do you look at this kind of adoption of this API-driven world, where when you look at the whole spectrum, big companies versus smaller companies, what challenges that you see people face when they tend to embrace these technologies, and how do you help them?
Sure. I think in practical terms today, the majority of developers are now spending their time interacting with or building APIs on a daily basis, right? The data is there now showing us that. So I think the ability there's a variety of tool sets out there for doing the actual development work of APIs. I think where we see the struggle in the market these days is, designing a platform is about a lot more than the technical implementation, right? It's about kind of how do you compose all of these capabilities that your company has into something that everyone understands. So we see the prevalence of like the API product manager being a much, a very in-demand role. And I think it's true both in terms of the kind of platform architecture as well as kind of your API product manager type folks. There are just not enough of them out there. So certainly where, we look at it from Stoplight's standpoint is, trying to learn what works at almost any scale, and provide that sort of toolkit and sort of the onboarding path so that if you can't hire those folks because there simply aren't enough of them, can we at least walk you through what folks from successful platforms are telling us work? So like we launched a podcast called API Intersection about, I think, a year and a half ago. And basically, the majority of guests are running API programs. And we ask them all the time, like, what are the things that you do? What works? And it's been really educational to see how often there's consistency in that approach. So it's been very instructive for us in trying to kind of build the platform to help folks do all the right things that go beyond just the development into really designing a cohesive platform that's really a collection of potentially hundreds of teams and different APIs that feel like one thing.
Security used to be someone else's problem. It was an afterthought. That is changing, but then we are looking at totally different space. We have legacy player, we have players who was born in the cloud native world for security. So when it comes to API, how do you look at security? Because we'll talk about your solutions and how you folks help companies, but I do understand the security aspect as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the security world has been going through a series of evolutions over the last 10, 20 years, right? Moving away from just network boundaries and, making sure patch levels are in place. There's a million ways to do that now. But because, APIs are such a low level programmatic interface to often the core of your system, they can be a high risk surface as well. So, the interesting thing is when you look at, hey, what are the real risk factors? And you look at, say, like the OWASP API top 10, which is sort of a group that gets together and figures out, hey, what happens most often in these API-driven compromises? It's a pretty predictable list. It's not unlike any other software. But what's interesting is how often you can catch those things at design time, rather than waiting until you've implemented the API. Catch those things up front. So I certainly point folks on a regular basis, like 42 Crunch, I think, is a great example of taking this approach. We're starting to lean into that more and more, but we typically rely on one of our open source projects called Spectral, which allows folks to sort of design rule sets to enforce or to lint against their API and sort of highlight where you might have, again, hundreds or dozens, whatever, of number of development teams. They're not going to read the standards. They're not going to read the rules. So automate that. And you can put rules around sort of authentication mechanisms, which is typically where you're going to get caught, right? And I think beyond that, testing obviously is, where you catch a lot of this stuff. And I think it's kind of like, the DevOps world, where this autonomy and authority has been given to development teams to take care of the infrastructure themselves a lot more, so that you don't have this siloing and handing things over the fence. I think kind of the DevSecOps world is, this same emerging pattern of how do you enable teams to do the right things? And, waiting until you've built it and you're about to put it in production, if you haven't even thought about security till that point, you're definitely doing it wrong.
If we go back to the work you folks do, let's start at the very beginning. That how do you help companies? At what stage you enter to help them build their API, strategy, and also you touched upon DevOps, DevSecOps. How much cultural change is actually happening versus there are still folks who are still doing development, and there are totally different teams who are doing operations?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that from Stoplight's perspective, we're very committed to this idea of shift left, and we see that our viewpoint is we're as far left as you can get without being on the marker board, right? At the time you decide you want to build a capability for your company, it's time to design an API, and that's where our customers, pull up Stoplight and start doing that without having to know OpenAPI and all of its weird syntax. But what I will say is about kind of the right way to build platforms and some of these things that you can do, frankly, at the marker board stage, is recognizing that one, it's not usually a technology problem that makes these sort of digital and platform transformations fail. It's the culture change, right? And certainly DevOps, DevSecOps, some of these things play a big role in it. Some of it is also just thinking in reusable terms. So rather than building that API to get that partnership, to get that integration working, stepping back and saying, hey, as a platform, how can we serve a whole host of partners with something reusable? And even before that, when we're building our internal capabilities, today we wouldn't imagine externalizing this, but let's build it with that acumen in mind, so that when some market opportunity presents itself, either in our own customer base or by way of partners, it's not going to be, oh, let's take the junky internal API and then build some duct tape and baling wire thing to externalize it, but rather design for the customer from the moment that you start designing, which in any other field of design, you would say, of course, you design with the customer in mind. And I think we see this shift from engineered experiences for developers, which seems to make sense, right? Of let a developer build something for another developer. But the culture shift that's most key is treat your API as a product and design that experience. And it's certainly not your UX designers that are going to do that. So it's kind of, who you involve in that. It looks different, but design that. Think about it up front before you write a line of code. And I think that kind of design first mentality is the shift that's happening in the market, and certainly kind of, where we see ourselves fitting.
Can you talk about what kind of products or services you have? Also, today, once again, we're talking about software. That software is in 90% cases open source software. So also talk about, because you folks do a lot of open source as well there. So talk about projects, products, how you actually help customers.
Yeah, the foundations of Stoplight really have, from the beginning always been open source. So our, Spectral, certainly the most well-known, is this sort of linting tool I had mentioned before to define rule sets. And you can think of this as take that tome of API standards and turn it into an automated rule set. And then within either, our platform, or it's open source, so in any other sort of mechanism you want, we also have a VS Code extension that's open sourced. See those errors as your developers are, or whoever it is designing that API. The second piece is Prism, which is basically a reverse proxy that's typically used in testing scenarios, but there's a whole lot more to what you can do with it. But essentially lets you create sort of mock APIs or fake APIs. You've got a design, you haven't built anything yet, so let's produce some mock responses. That can provide a lot of utility in design, in that you get this tactile feedback, right? You can actually write code against something that isn't real yet. But also obviously allow you to do, test-driven development in its myriad forms. And then our kind of third leg of open source is Elements, which is our React sort of component-based approach to building developer portals. And you can point that at any open API or at sort of the Stoplight platform projects. So those are all the foundational components that underlie the Stoplight platform. Which sort of ties those pieces together, as well as a variety of other things to provide a form-based editing experience on top of Open API. So what we see is one of the biggest challenges for folks trying to stand up a platform program is, okay, great, Open API seems to be the standard that everyone uses for defining sort of REST-style APIs. Now I'm going to do a 3 to 4 day class to teach all of my developers how that works. And it's time consuming, it's boring, and no one wants to learn it. So Stoplight provides sort of a visual experience for doing that, so that you don't even really need to know Open API. And we certainly, over the coming quarters, are moving in the direction of providing more and more governance capability and providing that sort of design review and feedback process.
I also want to talk about, if you can, of course, there are a long list of your customers, but if you can talk about, who are your typical customer, and of course you can share some use cases there. I mean, APIs, there is no specific use case, but just so that our folks will have some understanding of the company.
So I think some of what I find the most interesting use cases are the ones that aren't necessarily technology. So like if we look at Schneider Electric, right? They've got a whole partner program that sort of automates their supply chain. That has been tremendously successful in kind of digitizing how they, manufacture and get all the sort of supply components, how they resell through partners, that sort of thing. We've got on the technology side, though, like, Dell obviously is a huge collection of different brands, companies, divisions. So they've kind of got this API marketplace that helps connect all the different pieces within the business. So what's interesting about, I think, across all these different verticals and cases is, if you're going to go build an API to externalize and you need to document it and put it, out there for the world, that's great. And sure, you need to document it, whatever. I think where we see the biggest struggles for companies and where we play the bigger role is really, you'll see like microservice sprawl. You've gone and developed all these services, you got all these things running around. You really need to build that catalog of what are all the things that we have, what are all the things that we intend to build, and shift into that kind of reusability platform mindset. And start organizing your APIs, organizing the teams, and how they gain access to those things, how they collaborate. So I think that's kind of what we see pervasively across these different use cases. Certainly documentation and those things play a huge role, but I think we're more focused on kind of making sure the internal stuff is right with that mindset, as I said before, that sure, you can externalize, but get your house in order internally. I always say, like, if you can't manage the developer community inside your company, you stand little to no chance of succeeding externally, right? So get that community right, provide that internal developer portal, that discoverability for not just the developers, but the whole company to understand what capabilities do you have in APIs so that everyone's more kind of better equipped to have those discussions about how should we integrate, how should we partner, right? So I think that's kind of the overarching place where we fit in.
But how serious is this problem? Because we have been talking about this shift for a long time, the whole DevOps, DevSecOps movement. How much is it, because you actually help customers, how much is it already there, or you see there is a lot of work to be done, there a lot of education is needed, or you feel, hey, that's a solved problem, people have moved there, all we care about is technology solutions now?
Well, we think of Stoplight as sort of open API, or sort of a Figma for open API, right? We are focused on design. So when it comes to implementation concerns, I think there's any number of ways to go solve those things. And, we have companies ranging from Fortune 100s on down to small teams. They're all going to have a little bit different look as to how they tool that up. And open API is kind of the lingua franca for how you're going to do those things. Do companies have more work to do on those things? Absolutely. Are we big proponents of kind of, the DevOps revolution? Absolutely. It's not a revolution anymore. It's if you're not, then you're way behind. I think the same is true with kind of API strategy and platform strategy stuff. It's like, we do a lot of kind of content and, help out with our customers. But the truth is, we're providing them tools. And at the end of the day, we can't transform your culture. We can't transform the way you think about your own business. So, we do our best in that regard. But I think, we're seeing a shift happening in the business world around this. There's executives involved in a way that definitely was not the case 4 or 5 years ago. So a change is happening, and I think we're, a part of that change.
Jason, thank you so much for taking time out today, and of course talk about the company and also the kind of the trend, the larger, as you said, the cultural changes are there in this space, and we are moving towards the API driven. We're not moving, we are there. It's hard to say, because we were just talking Kubernetes a few years ago, and now it's in production. Everybody has moved there. So thanks for sharing some of the great insights that how companies should approach this API strategy. And I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, and I'd be happy to come back. Thank you.